a video on making pastry. So, I was reminded the other day that lard makes really kind of quite flaky pastry. And I was kind of thinking, yeah, and I don't normally use straight lard to make pastry. What I normally do is I make my own, what I call pastry fat. So the fat that I make pastry out of. And it is all the skimmings from the top of when I cook meat for cottage pie or roast joints of pork. Then you get the lard out of those, and it's basically 1/3. Oh yeah, and the fat from when I've braised a load of meat for pies. So like I use chuck steak. So and this fat comes out of it, and I skim that off the top of the cooking liquor, and I solidifies, and then I turn it into fat. I use 2 parts, or do I use half and half? No, I use 2 parts lard or beef pork fat to 1 part beef fat, and we get this lovely, not too soft, not too hard fat that makes pastry that's got all the flavour in from the cooked meats. But it's a bit faff, kind of collecting it all and making it all. So I kind of thought, well, we'll have a go with making some pastry with just lard. Oh, this is the pastry, by the way. It's lovely. It's lovely and short, and it's got all that flavour in from the cooking juice, the cooking meat. So it makes a really good pastry. And so I'm going to make 1 batch with lard, and then this is Stilton fat. So it is the leftover Stilton from functions. What I did was I fried it up to separate the fat from like the solids, and it's a bit of a lengthy process. I made a video. It's kind of quite interesting, but that's like clarified butter. So it's got this loads of umami kind of flavours to it. And I was thinking, I don't know what I'm going to do with it. I like you, because I'm ridiculous. I end up with far too many projects and things in the fridge and things in the cupboard. So I thought, well, let's make some pastry out of that. And because it's almost like clarified butter, but has a real funky umami Stilton kick to it. Not a kick, it's quite gentle. But I thought, make that kind of nice pastry. Now, when you're making pastry with butter, butter isn't a 100% solid fat. Butter is 80% fat and 20% whey. Where something like lard is 100% fat. And this Stilton fat will be 100% fat. And I was kind of thinking, oh, I really should have a go at making some pastry with some ghee, which clarified butter, to kind of see how that turns out. But that's essentially what this is going to be, like clarified butter. And I don't want to have to buy any. Now, so when you're making pastry with butter, these are my thoughts. When you're making pastry with butter, you're actually not using as much fat in the pastry. You still use, say, for example, a block of butter, 250 grams to 500 grams worth of flour. But that butter is not actually in the right ratio of fat to butter. It's slightly less fat than as if you were to use lard. So I was kind of quite curious about that. And then so that was kind of quite my thoughts, that we're not actually, butter isn't, it's not the kind of right ratios, and I don't know where I'm going with that, but it's always kind of been at the back of my mind. So a pastry made with lard will be different from a pastry made with butter. Yeah, so those were kind of like my thoughts. And then I've got a certain amount of water that I add. So most people add water until the pastry kind of comes together. I normally make 500 grams worth of fat to a kilo of plain flour. I suppose all-purpose flour in the rest of the world, but the flour that you make pastry out of. And then I put in 300 grams worth of water, and it works every time. It's a little bit wet to start off with, but over time the flour soaks up that excess moisture and it becomes a really good pastry to work with. Now, in the same way that when we're baking bread, so I learnt this from bread, you mix your bread together, all the wet with the dry ingredients, and you leave it for an hour, and then the water can completely soak into the flour. And when people talk about resting pastry before using it, make it, rest it, put it in the fridge for an hour, and then use it. Otherwise, it's quite elastic. It's not that you're actually resting. It's not that the gluten has suddenly become active in this flour. It's because all the liquid hasn't completely soaked into the flour. That's my thought anyway. So I'm going to make some pastry with that. I'm going to make some pastry with that. We're going to cannibalise that leftover pie, and we're going to use that meat that's in the pie. So we'll be back, and we'll kind of see if there's any kind of problems with that making pastry. We'll be back if there's any problems. Otherwise, we'll just be back when we've got some pastry made. You don't need to see me making pastry. It's pretty straightforward. Show you this. This is 250 grams worth of lard. This is 500 grams worth of flour. I've mixed it all in, rubbed it in with my fingers. This is 75 millilitres of water, which seems quite a lot of water for that amount of pastry. It's going to be fine. It's going to be fine. You'll think it's going to be too wet, but it will come together, and it seems like it's wet now. Give it an hour, and the flour will soak up that excess water, and we're left with a lovely pastry. So it can feel, if you listen to it, there's that water, but it's fine. It's soaked up all that water, and that's the right kind of ratio. I think it's important to have recipes that work. 75 grams worth of water for 500 grams worth of flour and 250 grams worth of pure fat, not butter. So this necessarily wouldn't work with butter. I might have to try that sometime, but it certainly works with a solid fat like lard. 75 grams worth of water. So as you can see, that's fine. We will rest that in the fridge, and then we'll have a look at it and we'll make something out of it. So the Stilton fat is more difficult to rub into the flour. It was at room temperature, but still more difficult to rub into the flour than the lard, and certainly a lot more difficult than the pastry fat that I make. So we have got it to the right consistency, rubbed in. So we'll add the 75 grams worth of water, and then we'll mix in, and we'll see if it mixes in. Oh, it mixes in the same. So I reckon that clarified butter would act in exactly the same way, and it should make a really kind of crumbly pastry. So it's mixed in a lot easier, but 75 grams is certainly the right amount of liquid. Looks like it's going to be a nice pastry, that. So it's got that cheesy umami smell to it. So that in there. We'll put a shower cap on top because we're trying to cut down on the plastic, and then we'll just rest those in the fridge. Well, rest, kind of the right word, because we're allowing the water to completely soak into the flour. Work this pastry a little bit and get it up to above fridge temperature. So, and it's starting to crack around the edges, so it's going to be a little bit difficult to work with, which is generally a good sign for a pastry. So if a pastry is too easy to work with, it generally means that it's going to be not particularly short. Whereas a pastry that's crumbling to bits generally means that it will bake really well and be nice and crumbly. That's not too bad, is it? Now we've warmed it up. I just moved it around in my hands, you know, kind of like squished it and moved it around, like you would do a bit of Play-Doh or putty or something like that. Just kind of warmed it up in my hands so it's a little bit easier to work with. Don't want to work it too much, otherwise the gluten in the flour will start to make it too what's the word I'm looking for? Rubbery. You essentially turn it into like a bread. So, I'm gonna make some pasties. I've already rolled out the dough. And I've cannibalised the pie. It could do with a bit more filling, like a little bit more gravy. But to be honest, I can't, be bothered. I just need a filling, and this is going to do the job. So there's still bits of pastry and all that kind of stuff, but I don't really care. And the pastry's probably a little bit too thick for a pasty. But I'm more bothered about how it tastes more than anything else. I'm doing the comparison to the lard. See, those have cracks there have happened. That's not a good sign. But I think it'd be nice and short. Let's roll that top over a bit. Might have to. It'll be fine. It'll be fine. But now we can look at this other pastry as a comparison and see how that holds up when we start to form it together. I should have done that. Probably could do to be a bit warmer, but it feels like we've just hit winter today. It was lovely on Saturday and Monday. Sunday and Monday it's just been miserable. Oh, that's no good, is it? That's one that's come out of there as well. What do you know? Let's just bake them and see how they are. Yeah, look at that. That's not going to fare so well in the oven, but we'll see what it's like. 180 for 40 minutes until they're cooked. Smell ready. Let's have a look. They'd look better if they had a glaze on them, but they look cooked. It's just a mess. Turn it off. Now, things taste different as opposed to when they're hot and when they're cold. That's very delicate, is that? That's the lard one. And that's the Stilton butter. Let's just give those a few minutes to cool down. If they're too hot, we won't be able to taste them properly. But they look good. They look good. And I haven't, if those holes would have been a problem if I'd have put something wet inside them. But there isn't anything wet inside them. So my pasty techniques need to be improved. Let's have a try. Let's go for the lard one first. That's nice and crumbly, isn't it? That's nice and crumbly pastry. That pastry is lovely. Maybe the lard, it's so crumbly. So, we now know what we've tuned our palate to what pastry should taste like. Let's taste this other pastry. Nice and flaky. It's got that cheesy, that Stilton-y smell to it. That's lovely, is that? And it's lovely and flaky. So, that's gone flaky. That's gone crumbly. So, that wants to break to bits, whereas that holds together better. That might be holding together better because it needed a bit more working. So when it was really cold, it needed kind of a bit of working to get it going, so it was sort of roll out. But that's lovely, that pastry. And of course I've just put another bit in my mouth when I should have been talking. So, we can compare it to that. So that's the pastry made with my pastry fat, which is full of flavour and nice and crumbly as well. So, we can make pastry using that Stilton fat. and we can also make a pastry from, I'm guessing, clarified butter or ghee, whichever kind, whatever you kind of want it. But now I'm thinking about it. If we were to make some butter pastry, which should probably be another video. If we were to make some butter pastry, and we wanted half fat flour, we'd have to put in more. We'd have to make up for that 20% of whey, the butter whey that's in the butter. So every 100 grams there's 20 grams worth of whey in there. So we would have to make a better butter pastry, we'd have to put in, instead of 100 grams of pastry, 100 grams worth of butter and 200 grams worth of flour, we probably have to put in 120 grams worth of butter, probably a little bit more even, to kind of compensate for that whey water, but then add less water to the pastry that we've rubbed together. But I think that'll be another video. But anyway, so that Stilton fat made into a pastry is lovely, and people would think that it's got some cheese in the pastry, but there we go. That's lovely, is that? I shall enjoy that, having that for my dinner. Oh, success.